Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this talk entitled "A Triple Bottom Line for Translation Technology." It is our great honor to have Dr. Joss Moorkens to join us today. I'm Clara Chuan Yu. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Translation, Interpreting, and Intercultural Studies here at Hong Kong Baptist University. I'm also a research fellow at the Center for Translation. So before the talk, please allow me to introduce Joss first. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Joss. Joss is an associate professor at the School of Applied Language and Intercultural Studies in Dublin City University. He is also the science lead at the ADAPT Center, a member of DCU's Institute of Ethics and Center for Translation and Textual Studies. He's also board member at the European Masters in Translation Network. Joss has published over 60 articles, chapters, and papers on the topics of translation technology, interaction, and evaluation, translator precarity, and translation ethics. He is a general co-editor of the journal Translation Spaces, co-editor of a number of books and journal special issues, and also co-author of the textbooks, Translation Tools and Technology, published by Routledge in 2023, as well as the book Automating Translation, Routledge 2025. I trust that when it comes to the topic of translation technology, we all know Joss. So without further ado, Joss, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lara. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for joining, wherever in the world you are. Lots of familiar faces in the video and in the list of participants. So yes, thank you very much for joining. So I'm going to share my slides, and over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about our proposal for a triple bottom line for translation technology, speaking first about large language models and machine translation, what the triple bottom line is, the origin of that idea, and then our application of it for translation technology, and towards the end, what we can potentially do towards sustainable translation technology. So this is probably a familiar slide to many of you who've seen this free code camp illustration, which is very handy and demonstrates the move from one paradigm to the next for machine translation, from rule-based to example-based to statistical machine translation to neural machine translation, and the changes that have happened over that time, moving from rule-based to data-based MT, but also from symbolic artificial intelligence, where what happens within the system can be understood by us. It's readable, legible symbols, comprehensible symbols, to sub-symbolic artificial intelligence, where the first thing that happens within a neural network is that the words and sentences are converted into sequences of numbers, upon which thousands and thousands of operations take place. So it means that we're working with black boxes and can't see exactly what's happening within the system. And that's what we have for large language models as well, moving from supervised to self-supervised neural networks. But another thing that's changed over time has been where the locus of research has taken place. So we used to pride ourselves in DCU of having an MT team that were competitive with other research groups around the world. And if we look at the results from the competitive shared task on machine translation, looking at English German from 2016, we can see that at the leaderboard of competing research teams, we have University of Edinburgh, NYU, Cambridge, KIT, and Karlsruhe. So a lot of university-based research teams at the top of the leaderboard. If we move on a few years to 2019, now it's big tech, Facebook, Microsoft, There's still a couple of university research teams there. University of Cambridge is there. We now have e-translation from the European Commission, but then back to Microsoft. And then another change as we move on to 2024, where the top performing systems are large language models. We've got GPT-4, Dubformer, Transmission MT, Unbabel, Tower. So Unbabel are the plucky newcomer with 100 million in venture capital funding, with their Tower multilingual large language model system, Mistral. And another thing we can notice when we move on from 2016 to 2019 to 2024 is that the way that these systems have been evaluated has changed. The scale is different. So in 2016, it was using blue scores, where we've got a human reference that's the MT output is compared with. By 2019, it's a 0 to 100 scale, so-called direct assessment, where we've got a crowd of people on the internet who are giving a score between 0 and 100 on a scale for each output. And then it's different again in 2024. So by 2024, it's using this ESA evaluation method. So it's error span annotation, a sort of combination of direct assessment, which is this 0 to 100 scale, using the crowd, and multidimensional quality metrics, an annotation method that was put forward as part of a project called Qt Launchpad in Qt21 in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And that's become the sort of de facto industry metric. But the problem with MQM is that it's expensive and it takes a lot of time. So ESA is trying to balance these things. So there's an opportunity for the evaluators to annotate specific errors, but also give their 0 to 100 scale. So my point here is that evaluation is difficult. So trying to balance the speed of response and cost is difficult. Then we've the added complication of the fact that large language models are general purpose tools, as OpenAI have called them. They have emergent abilities once we get to a certain scale. And at the moment, still, the apologies for the squeaky chair, the increasing abilities of large language models are really based on scale, adding more and more data. So we can see at a certain scale, there are increases in the ability to carry out arithmetic operations, or to transliterate, to unscramble words, question answering, natural language understanding. And because these are black box systems, it's not entirely explicable why at this sudden scale these abilities emerge. So when we evaluate and compare large language models with MT, it's not really comparing like with like. So here's an example of an evaluation from last year from Intento. And they used the prompt, "You are a professional translator, translate the text provided by the user from source to target language. The output should only contain the translated text." And we can see that large language models here, it was the PAM2 one from Facebook or from Meta that has performed best. And then I think the one after that is DeepL. But if we change the prompt, we'll get a different output. So that very much complicates matters. We don't know what the sort of best performing prompt will be, and that might change depending on the type of text, the domain, the language pair. There's a piece of work that we have under review that I've just completed with a group in Harvard Medical School, and our prompt ended up being quite complex, giving a lot of detail, far more than we have in this prompt. And if we look at comparisons of between these different metrics, so blue, the reference metric, COMET, which is a pre-trained metric, TER, it becomes very difficult to try and figure out what's the best performing system, what's the worst performing system, how many examples should we give. So 5-shot means that we're giving some examples to the system. It's not as easy as just comparing one system to another. There's an assumption that with increased scale that systems will just perform better in a sort of linear way. And this paper that was widely shared within the some groups involved with localization is an example focused on translation from a researcher who is, I think, between a London Business School and Stanford, and based on what it calls scaling laws, empirical relationships between the amount of training compute used for large language models and its performance, there's an assumption that translation performance will become quicker and more efficient in a linear way. And if you read through the paper, there's lots that this paper assumes. It assumes that all translation is the same, that there's not differences between languages, between domains, between quality expectations. And it ignores the effect that this might have on workers. It mentions that the gains from model scaling are much higher for lower skilled workers. And this is the sort of thing we've seen from papers by Delacqua, by Ethan Mollick. But it doesn't really take into account the effect this has on workers. It's only focusing on performance. And there's conflicting evidence that suggests that larger and more instructable language models are becoming less reliable. So I mentioned that OpenAI have called ChatGPT a general purpose technology. And this harks back to Langdon Winner in 1978, talking about how technology was at its most productive when its ultimate range of results is neither foreseen nor controlled. The positive side effects are a latent expectation or a desire implicit in any plan for innovation. The negative side effects, similarly, are experienced as necessary evils that we're obliged to endure. So essentially, these tools that are in perpetual beta are launched, and we are the petri dish. And there's a couple of suggested use cases, but the use cases are intended to emerge as we begin to use these technologies more often. But another thing that we have to take into account is the huge amount of hype behind these tools. And as a result, there's a real fear of missing out from businesses, from governments, from international organization, a lot of pressure for us in lots of different walks of life, lots of different jobs, to begin to use AI in our teaching, use AI in our translation, use AI in our businesses. They're the new state of the art for translation of high resource language pairs, not necessarily for those in medium and low resource, or so it appears. But there's a sense within lots of industries, if we don't do it, then someone else will. So with that in mind, the largest translation companies all have made clear that they have an artificial intelligence offering. And actually in a blog on the TransPerfect website, they've talked about this sort of fear of missing out, a sense that a lot of managers are putting pressure on people within their companies to have an artificial intelligence offering without any real idea of what the artificial intelligence is meant to bring. RWS have their Unlock Your AI Potential page. Of course, there's an AI heading. I lived in 2022 to 2023 in Iceland, and as an effort to try and keep their language relevant in the digital domain, the president of the country, the head of the biggest machine translation company, the head of a government government-funded group that called Almanaroma, that was trying to support Icelandic in the digital domain, all went on tour around big tech in the US And they ended up making an agreement with OpenAI and handing over all of their digital data in Icelandic, so that Icelandic was the second official language of GPT-4. Unofficially, some friends in Iceland have told me that they find that actually, despite not getting all this data, that Claude produces better Icelandic output. But nonetheless, the authorities there seem quite happy with how things have gone with OpenAI, and has produced this Icelandic approach, this playbook, so that other language communities can follow their lead. There's huge amounts of money involved. Of course, OpenAI recently said they'd raised another 6.6 billion in new funding at 157 billion post-money valuation to accelerate progress on their mission. This is news about Hong Kong from Ireland, about cutting thousands of civil service jobs to invest in AI. I'm not sure how totally factual that is, because Ireland's a long way from Hong Kong. Hong Kong IPOs surge as AI hype fuels investor interest. So huge amounts of hype. We have government initiatives where, for example, in Ireland, they want 75% of businesses to be using AI by 2030. Whether they have a reason to use AI, that's a whole other matter. And there's a big new AI push at European Union level. So this is happening across governments, across institutions, huge amounts of pressure. And as Anthony Pym says, the public discourse on generative AI is thus so vociferous, so polarized, so ill-informed, so removed from empirical assessment that in the space of public discourse, the technology is assumed either messianic or demonic proportions. But as I've mentioned, empirical assessment is difficult. And that assessment tends to only focus on performance, not looking in a more holistic way at the effects of implementing technology, large language models, AI. But there's a sense, as I've said, that everyone needs to implement AI. There's the Slater report of the top 50 under 50 months language AI companies. A lot of them are in the audiovisual, multimedia space. Translation management systems have all implemented generative AI, but interestingly in different ways. So there's no one clear best implement. So you've got MemoQ that are following work by our former PhD student in DCU, Yasmin Moslem, using TM suggestions as many shot prompts, so up to 6 TM suggestions to steadily improve or contextualize the machine translated output. We've got localized with different buttons to increase the length, to shorten, to rephrase. We've got Lilt, which uses Amazon Bedrock, so we can go to lots of different large language models and do multilingual text generation. So rather than having a linear source to target relationship, we can have a single prompt to produce multilingual output. So lots of different offerings, and it's not clear what is the best implement. And for most of them, not an option to vary the prompt, which can make a huge amount of difference, as I've mentioned. The way we've evaluated machine translation in the past, well, that's changed over time. There was a quote in the early 2000s by a researcher from the University of Essex, Yorick, who said that evaluation of MT was more advanced than MT itself. And since then, it's advanced even more. So we've moved from so-called reference or string-based metrics like BLEU, where we've got one or more supposedly perfect or gold standard reference translations that we compare the output with. And then since around 2020, we've had pre-trained metrics using neural networks. And this assumes that we have enough data for these language pairs. Most prominent and popular of these is probably Comet, that was produced by Ricardo Rey, working with Unbabel, with Blurt, XComet, and others. And then we've got human evaluation. So I mentioned multidimensional quality metrics, or MQM, earlier, which is a modular way of annotating different types of errors of different severity, critical, major, minor. And MQM is now incorporated in different standards like the ISO recent 5060 standard, or the ASTM recent standard for translation with technology. And then there are composite benchmarks looking beyond translation for giving lots of different tasks to large language models to give us some sort of benchmark of quality. But that doesn't really tell us how good it will be for our specific purpose. So I mentioned that the focus is generally only on performance. And this was a criticism of a paper called Green AI in 2020 from Roy Schwartz and others, published in the oh, now I can't think of what the publication was. It was the oh, apologies, I can't think of the journal that was part of. But the argument was that there's an exclusive focus on performance when using one AI metric or one evaluation metric or another, and it discourages a holistic approach to AI system development. By focusing only on performance, they said this, they call this red AI, and said that it's pushing development in the wrong direction. That was it, IEEE it was. Considerations of efficiency and sustainability are ignored in the quest for ever greater performance, a tendency that pushes AI development in the wrong direction. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment, and I want to introduce the idea of the triple bottom line that we've taken from business ethics in our proposal. So in business ethics, things have moved on a little from the 1970 credo from Milton Friedman that the social responsibility of a business was to increase its profit, something that was very influential in the 1970s and 80s, to the idea of corporate social responsibility that was codified probably in the 1990s. And Carroll put forward this pyramid of corporate social responsibility that you can see on the right-hand side. So we've got our biggest responsibility, which is the economic responsibility to be profitable and to return dividends to our shareholders. It's the foundation upon which all others rest. It's our most important responsibility. Subordinate to that are legal responsibilities to obey the law, as law is society's codification of right and wrong. We need to play by the rules of the game and not just follow the law, the letter of the law, but actually follow the spirit of the law, what it's intended to do. Subordinate to that are ethical responsibilities, and that is to be ethical, to do what our society see as mores, to be fair, to avoid harm. And then we have, subordinate to that, philanthropic responsibilities, to be a good corporate citizen, to contribute towards the arts, towards education, towards our communities, to improve the quality of life. And this was the same sort of idea that was brought in by DeGeorge later, talking about respecting the rights of employees, consumers, and society in general. And it was from this sort of idea of business ethics that the triple bottom line came from, proposed by John Elkington in a book called Cannibals with Forks in 1997. And what he said was that he wanted to foment complete system change. So when he went back to this in 2018, disappointed with how it was sort of balanced one against another. But the problem here is this can only really be a sort of heuristic. We can't really measure in a numerical way one versus another. So the triple bottom line talked about the balance of people, planet, and profit. So by people, an organization shouldn't exploit the stakeholders in the organization. So the stakeholders are the people who are involved in whatever the organization produces. It should ideally contribute to their well-being along with all the others involved with the production of output. Planet, cause no ecological harm, limit energy consumption and waste, and interestingly, carry out a full life cycle assessment of products from the point at which they're produced to the point at which they're destroyed. And then for profit, profit is the economic sustainability of an organization, so not just dividends to shareholders. Because if an organization isn't economically sustainable, well, that doesn't benefit anyone because then the organization must end. So this includes not just economic capital, but also human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, natural capital. So quite a broad understanding of profit. Relatedly, in business ethics, we have the likes of Dominic Millay in this book that was first published in 2009 and a revised version published in 2019, where he talked about how a company can follow a shareholder approach where they're focused on return of investment to shareholders or to dividends to shareholders, or a stakeholder approach where we're trying to benefit all those people involved in the organization, all of these stakeholders, or a common good approach, trying to benefit everyone in our society. Interestingly, Millay says that from his perspective, taking a stakeholder or a common good approach doesn't mean that we're ignoring shareholders. That, you know, for a business to be economically sustainable, it needs to keep the shareholders happy. But also, it can be a real business benefit to have a common good approach. And we can see this in some organizations and businesses where they really foreground the ethics of the company, and that can be of benefit. We don't have great examples of that, sadly, within translation, but some organizations, as I'll come to later, really make an effort to foreground ethics in their offering. So taking ethics as a guide for human excellence, business ethics, according to Millay, can be a guide for human excellence in business organizations. He calls sustainability nothing other than the common good for future generations. So this common good approach is good for sustainability. In translation studies, when we're evaluating translations, we've also expanded our purview from linguistic approaches to functionalist approaches. So there's Katarina Rice, sociological approaches, expanding to polysystem theory, expanding into cultural and political approaches of Maria Timoshko here. So our purview has expanded of how we consider translation quality. Some views of translation quality that were put forward by a group including Alan Melby and Paul Fields in 2014, different ways of evaluating quality within an industry context, drawing from work by Garvin from 1984. They suggested that there can be the transcendent approach, the idea that quality is an innate characteristic that's both absolute and universally recognizable. We just know what a good translation is. It's often how we mark translations within universities. And it's this idea that we all have this idea what quality is, but it's difficult to define it. Or there's the product-based approach, seeing a product or a service's quality is quantifiable based on certain ingredients or attributes. So this might fit with MQM, or looking for errors. If there are very few errors, that means it's high quality. A user-based approach, the degree to which a product or service satisfies user needs or preferences. So in research, we might look at task-based evaluation, getting users to complete tasks. And if it works for the user, then it's high quality. A production-based approach views quality as conformance to requirements. So following an ISO standard, if we have certain levels of a number of eyes looking at something, a number of revisers, different people doing different tasks, different people revising a translation produced by the first person, that means we're more likely to produce a quality translation. Or a value-based approach assesses quality in terms of costs, benefits. More benefits outweigh costs, the more a product or service increases in value. And here we see sort of a fitness for purpose approach employed in the industry. Another idea that we drew from in our triple bottom line proposal is from Christina Abdallah's idea of a 3D quality process. So Christina put forward the idea that we have product quality, the idea that the product satisfies certain needs, or process quality, the sort of ISO processes I talked about before, that if the process is follows certain steps, that the product will be of good quality. But she felt indivisible from these were social quality, the idea that the interactions and relations of the people involved in the production network, it'll affect process quality which in turn affects product quality. If someone isn't feeling good, if they're not paid well, if their conditions are poor, then they're not going to be able to produce their best quality translation. The idea of unified validity is something that was put forward by Samuel Messick from educational psychology, where he said that key issues of test validity are the meaning, relevance, and utility of scores, the import or value implications of scores as a basis for action, and the functional worth of scores in terms of the social consequences of their use. So if we have scores and we use those as a basis for action, well, then maybe our barometer for or the level of validity required should be higher. And we need to think about the social consequences of their use. So, for example, for the claim in 2018 that Microsoft's English to Chinese news translation had achieved human parity, that was based on non-sequential human translations, not all of high quality, that were compared with machine translations using blur scores, just a reference-based metric that has lots of problems, as mentioned earlier, to do with not penalizing certain more important words or not penalizing word order so much, and doesn't really correlate with human judgment. But nonetheless, based on these claims of human parity, this was reported on critically, and it meant that people felt, well, why don't we just use NMT? Why are we bothering with translators? When really there were problems with the validity of this claim, and the barometer for making that claim should have been higher when there were clear social consequences. In the industry, we see lots of different processes that affect quality. The way that machine translation is integrated differs from one organization, one process to another. And we're seeing a lot of instances of work being broken down into chunks. O'Brien noticed this in 2012 and talked about how in some domains the notion of a text with a beginning, middle, and end has changed radically. And the sort of process followed in Unbabel, where we have a customer relations text, machine translated, and then there's an automatic quality check. If the quality estimation tool deems that the quality is not good enough, then the decomposed sections of the text are sent to the Unbabel community. They retranslate or post-edit. Then the task is recombined and the customer gets the translated text. This gives the sense that translation, according to a respondent to Courtney and Phelan in 2019, is more like working on an assembly line. And I've written a little about this in an article about digital Taylorism from 2020 in Translation Spaces. We see this in the audiovisual space, where from 2018, from a presentation from Ayuno, now combined with FDI Media, the world's biggest audiovisual translation company, in 2018, companies such as Ayuno were offering fast turnaround. So Otok talked in Language and the Media in 2018 about 2-hour turnaround of translation of 45-minute Korean premium dramas into English. That involves breaking the content down into 15-minute chunks, translating with the aid of wikis and URLMT on proprietary platforms. So translators were waiting at their desks. The pieces of the material were sent to them with a demand for a very fast turnaround. Within the 2-hour limit, the translation, the subtitles are sent back to a project manager who does a quick check, recombines the whole, and then it's sent out. And rationalization in the industry means that once something is translated once, it's unlikely to be translated again. So and these Korean to English subtitles were then the pivots from which the other language versions were created, meaning that if there were errors, then these would be propagated further. And it was interesting in a piece of research that myself, Anna Gerberoff, and David Orrego Carmona did a couple of years ago, when we tried to compare the narrative engagement and enjoyment and comprehension for subtitles of a Latin American telenovela between MT, post-edited, and human translation. We found that the post-edited and human translations were both equally well accepted and understood and enjoyed by our users. But in that experiment, we also found that there was a lot of work done on the machine translation. There were a lot of edits, and our research participants had really spent a lot of time making good post-edited versions. Within this short turnaround, it's again very difficult to do your best work. And working within platforms is becoming increasingly common for translation. There are certain norms we might expect for translations, expectancy norms, the extent to which a translation will conform to readers' expectation for a translated text, according to Andrew Chesterman. But this bumps up against Jurahi and Sutherland's discussion of how the ability to understand and make use of algorithms has become a core competency of workers attempting to retain autonomy. And often when working within platforms, not just in translation, there's algorithmic management. So we see from the likes of Translated's T-rank system that even if employment is not completely automated, there are recommendations to project managers based on things like how politely they communicate or how quickly they respond, whether they get their work back in time. There's lots of different attributes upon which decisions are made, all fed into an algorithm, including ratings of translation quality, but that's just a small part of it that will decide whether they're employed again. And that's why I said last year that conforming to algorithmic norms will dictate whether a freelance translator will be engaged again or not. And it thus fulfilling the algorithmic requirement becomes a primary need, and will become more important than fulfilling the expectancy norms of the translation itself. And judging by the work of Fair Work in Oxford in the UK, a lot of online platforms don't fulfill minimum standards of fair work, considering fair pay, fair representation, fair terms and conditions. Interestingly, Translated and Creative Words have both worked with Fair Work to try and improve their terms and conditions. And you would hope that they would see some sort of benefit either from their work with translators or from their customers. But according to Diego Crescieri from Creative Words, he hasn't really seen the benefits yet. But fair play for getting involved in improving those terms and conditions. So for translators, according to Max Derryagin from ABTE, and who now works for Plint, quoted in the Guardian newspaper, this should be a golden moment. We have insane volumes of work. Instead, we have widespread stress and burnout as subtitle translators try to make ends meet. And I linked this to something by Minna Roukkonen. So her and Aileen Svan, sorry, my dog is waiting to go out the door here. Her and Aileen Svan wrote for Translation Spaces in 2024 in their special issue on job satisfaction in translation. If the translation profession is to survive, it needs to be perceived as being worthy of lifelong commitment. And this can only be achieved if translators' passion for the intrinsic nature of their work is acknowledged and nurtured, which necessitates granting translators greater autonomy and power over their working conditions. However, as I've demonstrated, the tendency in especially the largest translation companies is moving in the other direction. Of course, not all translation. The industry is hugely varied. But if translators working for those largest organizations are working within digital platforms where their autonomy is being removed rather than increased, where they're working on decomposed sections of work, well, that will have impacts on their satisfaction and motivation. The idea of scientific management is put forward by by Taylor in 1911, and from his experiments since 1898, assumes that workers are primarily motivated by money and that improved rates of pay will compensate for reduced autonomy and repetitive work. Although, of course, in translation, we're not seeing improved rates of pay, and there's been a very much a flat payment rate since around 2000 in most jurisdictions. That hasn't really increased with the cost of living and with inflation. But in 1967, Hertzberg proposed a motivation hygiene theory of job attitudes, suggesting there are both motivating job content factors and demotivating factors whose absence creates dissatisfaction. So the demotivating factors, they can motivate us up to a point. If they're not there, we'll be demotivated. So if we don't have status, job security, salary pay, work conditions, holidays, fringe benefits, but the things that positively motivate us in work, all of us, are intrinsic. And research over time has borne this out, although the division between demotivating and motivating isn't always as clear-cut as Hertzberg put forward. But those intrinsic motivators are challenging work, being recognized for our achievements, responsibility, meaningful work, involvement in decision-making, and sense of importance to an organization. So if we think back to working within a platform where there's very little autonomy, where work is broken into chunks, where your work is automatically evaluated, that really mitigates against these motivating factors. And my link that I'm trying to make is back to the imposition of large language models, of increasing automation, of integration of AI in a way that's imposed without any discussion, and the effects that this will have on motivation. And we hear a lot about translators wanting to leave the industry. It's very hard to measure this in any sort of valid way, but there is something of a crisis of motivation, satisfaction, and payment. What's suggested in the literature on work system sustainability is that instead of focusing exclusively on short-term static efficiencies, such as productivity and profitability in the short term, we must also focus on long-term dynamic efficiencies, such as learning and innovation. And for a work system to be sustainable, it needs to attain a just balance in development between all stakeholders, balancing long and short-term needs. So, of course, profitability is important, but this is where the triple bottom line comes in. We need to balance people, planet, and profit. This links in with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So number 8 is sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. And decent work is defined quite clearly from the International Labour Organization. The planet part. So especially since this paper by Emma Strubel in 2019, there's been a lot of discussion about environmental sustainability and neural networks. So Emma Strubel and her colleagues said that researchers should prioritize computationally efficient hardware and algorithms. And they measured that the very largest neural networks in 2019 produced, or were estimated to produce, the same CO2 emissions as 5 cars over the 20-year lifetime of those cars. Jesse Dodge and others suggested that they're using a software carbon intensity information would be useful for reducing environmental impact. But trying to measure these environmental impacts is very difficult because the impact differs from one jurisdiction to another. We can see from Dimitar Sterinov and Eva van Massenhove, the work that they did in Ireland. Then when they moved to Tilburg, the same work. The power came from different levels of fossil and renewable origins. But LLMs are highly costly and ecologically supercharged. Sam Altman said the cost to train GPT-4 was about $100 million. The most recent Google model has been estimated at about $191 million. And our energy consumption per capita in different jurisdictions are increasing, according to the International Energy Agency. So the average for the world in terms of energy consumption in kilowatt hours is 3.427. We can see that Hong Kong is working at almost double that, Ireland very little below. And in terms of CO2 emissions per capita, China is very much at the top because of the level of coal used in the production of electricity, although Hong Kong is separate to that, and the CO2 emissions per capita are running at about, we're at a fraction of that, so coming 70th, Ireland 67th. But our emissions individually are increasing. And a real question that we have in lots of areas is the increased needs of data centers for lots of different reasons. The prediction from the head of the national grid in the UK is that data center power use will surge sixfold in the next 10 years from 2024. Future growth in foundational technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing will mean larger scale, energy intensive computing infrastructure, according to John Pettigrew. In Ireland, 21% of our national energy capacity goes to data centers at the moment. But we can see from information from KPMG that colocation data centers capacity growth is huge. We can see the current capacity and the under construction capacity with in the East Asian region here in the top left, established markets for data centers, and these are increasing. There's also political pressure on increasing data centers. At the moment in Ireland, because 21% of our capacity is going to data centers, that's meant that there's a moratorium currently on building new data centers. And as a result, we're seeing pressure from big tech employers. So there's 4,200 people employed by big tech or by Amazon in Ireland. And this recent newspaper article where an Amazon boss has said that there's a major risk to Ireland as long as data center ban remains. So essentially, there's an implicit threat here. If you want to continue having growth in employment by Amazon, then you need to provide us with more capacity for data centers, because of course, that's a very big part of their offering. And this is complicated by the geopolitical situation, of course. Now, there are lots of claims about the requirements of data centers. They are indeed huge. But if we compare the effectiveness of different lifestyle decisions, and there's the argument about to what extent this should be down to individuals or down to big corporations, and the balance is somewhere in the middle, as far as I'm concerned. The difference between asking ChatGPT 50,000 fewer questions and hang drying clothes instead of using a dryer, or switching to a hybrid car, or buying green electricity is huge. And if we're to use green heating to live carbon-free, that will make a very big difference to our individual CO2 outputs, rather than asking ChatGPT 50,000 fewer questions. So we do have to put these concerns in scale. But then, of course, as we scale up generative AI, there's going to be huge requirements. The estimate is that there's 300 to 400 million users of generative AI currently, but it's being built into every single tool we use, such as Zoom, such as Google search. So now at the top of a lot of searches, we'll have generative AI output from Gemini. So as it's built into lots of different online tools, then there are these increased energy requirements. But also, putting this in scale, we need to think about how around 300 ChatGPT queries will use up 1 gallon of water in a data center for cooling. And of course, this differs again from one area to another. And it's notable that a lot of data centers have been built in dry regions in Spain, in India, and of course they have to be inland because salty air has a bad effect on the computing. But if we put this in comparison with the amount of water required to produce one meat hamburger, for us smug vegetarians, it's about 90% less. But for producing one meat hamburger, that's about 660 gallons. So a lifestyle change there will make a huge difference, much bigger than making fewer ChatGPT queries, or if there's a repairing of a lot of leaky pipes. But another concern is that the exacerbation of the digital divide, the global digital divide between the haves and have-nots with technology. As I mentioned, data centers are being built in arid, dry areas, often amongst people who will use the technology least. Those who are seeing the fewest benefits from technology are those who are most affected by climate change. And the fear is that these sort of technology will exacerbate this sort of digital divide. So finally, I get to the point. This was our proposal, this triple bottom line of people, planet, and performance, trying to adjust Elkington's triple bottom line from business ethics. So our proposal from our article in Just Trans last year was that for people, we think about how our technology, our large language model, our translation technology impacts them, looking at the people who annotate data, and of course, for reinforcement learning using human feedback, there are huge armies of workers who there's a lot of reporting about how they're poorly paid, there's poor conditions. Translators, platform workers, those whose data is dispossessed. Many of us who work in the academic domain, anything that we produced open access, we can assume has been used as training data, but also through the investigations of LibGen, we can see that lots of books were illegally used by for training lots of large language models, and our publishers are working and making deals like the Taylor and Francis Routledge deal for 10 million for using Routledge publications. For planet, the energy cost, CO2 emissions. There is the move towards efficient models. There is the ICT costs, the cost of producing, the rare metals required in producing our ICT materials, the disposal, which is very expensive and difficult, and often is done with dubious legality in less developed countries. There are reports of disposal of ICT technologies in Cambodia, in Kenya, in quite dangerous and polluting conditions. Then performance, not just using blue scores, but using task appropriate and comprehensive standards. So this was our proposal. One thing that we didn't really make enough play of, though, is of course that LLMs can benefit people in quite concrete ways. And an example, I go back to the work that I did with Harvard Medical School, and the evaluation we did there was looking at patient discharge instructions and translating from English to Spanish using large language models. Now, the assumption that they would have had was that the previous human translations were perfect, and these were the reference gold standard translations that you would use to compare with the MT output. But when we used MQM, or a carefully chosen subset, we discovered that there were just as many errors and more critical and major errors in the human translations than there were in the LLM output. And there are concrete implications of having a faster translation turnaround. There are notable health implications for having 2-week turnarounds for translations involving people getting hospital diseases or not starting their recovery better. So for people who with speaking languages other than English in the US, and we were looking in pediatrics, so for sick kids, essentially there were negative implications with these 10-day or 2-week waits for human translation for discharge instructions. So there were concrete improvements that could be made to their lives, and we have to take that into account. As I mentioned earlier, there are companies in the translation space using ethics as a business model. Lots of companies have foregrounded their ethics and common good as part of their mission. I can think of 2M in Brisbane, who have made a big play of behaving ethically. Lots of companies have become B Corp certified. Hope is that if successful, these could improve the outlook for the translation industry by being powerful exemplars of ethical behavior for others to follow. But the challenge is for these companies and organizations to balance financial sustainability with their ethical behaviors. And to publicly espouse these behaviors leaves them open to challenge if they fall below their own standards. So I'm thinking, for example, of Powerling in France, who are B Corp certified, yet when they bought over another company, didn't pay the legacy debts to freelance translators, or the difficulties with AJT translation. So Anya Jones gave loads of talks about ethics and translation companies, and was a real force for good, and still is, but ended up a year after receiving an ethical translation business award from EUATC, having to close down due to difficulties regarding the of money, or cash flow rather. So, and there's a sense that generative AI is at the peak of inflated expectations and now falling toward the trough of disillusionment. So maybe we'll become more realistic in the use of translation technologies, but we need to be realistic in our evaluations and think about the social consequences of their use. We starting to see these sort of articles. The Washington Post, the AI hype bubble is deflating. Now comes the hard part. OpenAI are admitting, or at least some people involved with OpenAI are admitting, that the path to smarter AI using scale has hit limitations. Although Sam Altman says there is no wall, we can just continue to scale. And of course, we don't just need to use large language models. There are the largest language models that are closed source, maximized for performance on a wide range of tasks with high environmental impact. The training data and true cost are hidden. There's open source large language models where training data is a bit more transparent, but not entirely. But we also have small language models fine-tuned for specific tasks, and they might outperform large language models on these specific tasks. Plus, training data, environmental impacts, these are transparent in the open source versions of these small language models. We can minimize our environmental footprint and have a bespoke small language model that will work well for our task. And that was something we wrote about in our book, Automating Translation. And just 2 days ago, this article appeared in Wired magazine about how small language models are the new rage, researchers say, with this nice illustration of someone pruning a small language model tree. So in closing, I've gone a little longer than anticipated. It's over an hour, and apologies to everyone involved. But as Elkington stressed, the need to change from an extractive approach to modes which over time actively rebuild economic, environmental, human, social capital, this is important. And as Donella Meadows says, we can listen to what the system tells us, discover how its properties and our values can work together to bring forth something much better than could ever be produced by our will alone. These are all important things to take into account. We need to balance people, planet, and performance. The question is how. Our proposal is very much a heuristic. It's not something that you can just take and put into action, but it's hopefully a step towards thinking about performance in a different way. And these sort of ethical concerns, they should be considered by all of us: technology developers, translation buyers, translation agencies, translators, consumers, educators. Our graduates will move into influential positions in the industry. Can they bring forward evaluation beyond just performance? That's something we need to challenge ourselves with. But I'll leave it with that for now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk, Joss. It was there's a lot of food for thought. So now we will open the floor for questions. You may raise your hand, unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can leave the questions in the chat box. We have, I guess, plenty of time for Q&A. Yes. Joss, and if I may ask you, actually, I have two questions about sustainability. Maybe I'll just raise one of them first. One is about the use of the bots. So we were talking about the sustainability, and also you mentioned this algorithmic, the trend of the algorithmic engines. It reminds me of an article that I read about Wikipedia. So it was one of the founders of Wikipedia posted that the cost of the infrastructure raised by 50% since January, attributing to the massive page scraping by bots. So that reminds me of translation as well, with all those automated generated translations. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts. Sometimes when we go to the web pages, it's automatically translated as well. So in that sense, which doesn't involve humans at all. So I don't know if there is any recent research regarding the automation of translation and its contribution to the increase of the digital and technological infrastructures that subsequently also leads to, the increased storage and the use of the data centers, and then the sustainability of the planet as well.
I would suspect that the effect of that sort of machine translation, while it's important that that users are aware that their content is machine translation, especially if there's a risk involved, and we're very much pushing the risk towards the user by automatically having machine translation of websites. In terms of data center and energy usage, I would suspect that our use of Netflix and of Zoom, as we're using at the moment, would make a far bigger impact. So if we look at the amount of water required for a ChatGPT query, for example, it's estimated to be something around 100 or 125 milliliters, depending where the data center is. Whereas a 1 hour Zoom call, and we've gone over an hour so far, that's over 2 liters, or 10 minutes of watching 4K video if we've got a high quality subscription video on demand subscription, that'll be similarly over 2 liters. So more and more people are using subscription video on demand, and more people are using the likes of Zoom. So that is probably going to have a bigger impact. But it's not that the impact of automatic translation is negligible. And especially I mentioned the fact that, a lot of search pages now will include LLM output or generative AI suggestions at the top of the page. As that becomes more widespread, the scale of it will make a very big difference. For generative AI, the real cost is in training rather than the inference stage. The training is very costly and has a big impact. The inference is comparatively small. I don't know if that answers your question, yeah, Clara, but as best I can, and of course there are people who can speak far more authoritatively about this than I can. Yeah,
thanks. Yeah, I think it's some like like we will have to wait and see the consequences and answer the question that you put in as to
It's
how.
also very difficult to pick out the consequences of an individual thing in the context of, when everything uses data centers that are so widely geographically distributed. Our access to data centers disappears usually into the AWS cloud, and this is distributed across multiple data centers globally.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question in chat box from Nesma. So thank you for important and informative presentation. How can we measure the planet part in the model? Do we really solely do we rely solely on data released online?
It's very difficult to do so, and there are continuous proposals about how we might go about evaluating the planet part. If you want to look for the most recent proposals, it's probably best to follow someone like Sasha Luciani from Hugging Face, who is working actively with a group of researchers on this. But I have no better suggestion than that, unfortunately. Oh, and there's a hand up from Mirko.
Yep.
So Mirko, do you want to unmute yourself? Good to see you.
Yes, yeah, nice. Thank you. Great talk. Just very inspirational, I think, and it's really overdue in general. I think as an industry that we take a more holistic approach, and maybe so that leads kind of to my question as well. Is we've really reached the stage now, I think, where the technology has started to deliver what its promises, and we as an industry, I think, we're missing a little bit on the opportunity at the moment still to use this technology to deliver on our mission, which is essentially something like making this multilingual world where the language diversity is maybe not a barrier. Just note, I'm careful not to say that language is a barrier. I don't like that. It's the diversity or the differences maybe in languages that's kind of build barriers. Language as such is the opposite of a barrier, right? I mean, it lets us communicate anyway. But so where we can actually start delivering on and working towards a multilingual world, and we're really not doing that today. I think in general, in the way we communicate, even within the language community, we're not leading, by example, or so, to show how we can actually make sure that everyone can contribute, can take part in all the debates that matter, including in multilingual Europe. We're not doing that. So I just wondered, and sorry, and then I'll get to my question, because you did allude at some point briefly at the benefits of LLM as well. That is something that you put less the highlight on. You put more in the risks and potential implications. But is that a benefit that we could develop further? Do you think there's something that we can do proactively, basically, to use this technology to work more towards a multilingual world within the framework that you described? I don't know if that's a very clear question, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mirko. It's definitely a fair criticism to level at the work that I've done and that others have written about to do with ethics and MT and AI, that it tends to dwell on the negative. And I wouldn't suggest that a common good approach means just turning off the machines. There are definitely concrete benefits, and you're right that I alluded to those more than really talking about those. They are not, I would suggest that they're not fairly distributed, because if you look at, for example, the European Language Equality book, which is an open access book that anyone can download on Springer. Unfortunately, it is, of course, as the name would suggest, very Eurocentric. It was part of a European funded project. But on page 80 or 81 of that, there's a table, and it's an update. So Mirko, you'll remember the MetaNet documentation. So this is for European languages, I think there's 90 languages on the table, talking about how well supported they are. And the only one that comes through as being very well supported is English. And then next we have Spanish, German, and maybe French. So there's a huge disparity between the amount of language data available, the language technologies available. So we're not really talking about a level playing field. So while our results were good for English Spanish, we're currently working with English Arabic, the work I was doing with Harvard Medical School, which thankfully is not government funded, because otherwise that would have been cut already. And yeah, so the differences are going to be huge between Arabic and then the next one we have is Haitian Creole. So that's going to be hugely different again. So yeah, it's not a level playing field in terms of languages, in terms of domains, and there will be really big disparities we'll see. Plus, the sort of underlying cultural language is English, and that affects the output in other languages. I'm afraid my battery is running a bit low, so if this runs out anytime soon, I apologize in advance. So I don't think that those benefits will be evenly distributed, and there's a risk they could exacerbate the digital divide, but there are concrete benefits. It's a short answer from my perspective.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mirko.
Thanks.
Clara, I'll try and see if there's other questions I can quickly answer.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe from Chris first, the comment on the effectiveness of in-person interactions versus those online.
So networking online is far less effective than in-person interactions and to travel occasionally regular client. Yeah, well, I find it far less effective. You know, having if I was in a room with all of you, you know, we'd be able to chat about things, have a coffee afterwards, build relationships. I find it very difficult to build relationships online. But you know, personally, it's something I consider with, you know, in terms of travel. I was in Singapore in January, and I try not to do more than one sort of long haul trip every year. But you know, that trip to Singapore alone is probably going to produce more CO2 emissions than the amount of generative AI I'll use for the rest of my life. You know, so we do have to make these changes, these compromises, and think about, you know, our own personal choice. It's not something that we can completely just, you know, decide, well, it's if these big tech companies make a change, then that will be far more effective. But that's my thought on it anyway.
Yeah, I think Anna.
It's that balance. Anna. Hi, Anna. I'm concerned small impact AI generated answers are added to Google search results, whether you want. Yes, absolutely. One makes hundreds of Google search for each translation, multiplying the impact. Being a people pleaser, AI does not help in translation research. It tries to tell me all my hypotheses are right, so I need to ignore them anyway. So I get a product I did not ask for giving me answers that are useless to me. But yeah, I 100% agree. I have nothing to add to that. But thanks, Anna. Good to see you again. Chris, also the importance of physical presence at events like UETF, where the organizers exclude hybrid options from the outset. Yeah, it's a tough balance to make. Omar, first, thank you for your meaningful address. I'd like to ask, despite your wish for a balanced situation in the industry, we all know enterprises always prioritize profit above everything else whenever possible. How do you suggest to keep that balance globally? Thank you. I don't want to speak for everyone in the industry. That I don't think everyone does only focus on profit above everything else, but you know, I don't think that's probably the case. And I think that's very much short-termism. That, you know, there are more and more anecdotal reports of translators leaving the industry, and if we want to have a sustainable industry, if we want to have people to produce our translation, our training data, and good quality training data at the very least, but also to be able to provide trustworthy, low risk translations, then, you know, we need to have people on side. And if, as Christina Abdallah says, people are working in poor conditions, they're not going to produce their best work. So it's very difficult to see how we can be effective in sharing that message, but we probably should try and share that message in the best way that we can in these fora, in our interactions with industry and with the institutions. I'm involved in the European Masters in Translation Network, but the huge tide of AI hype does mitigate against that. Vaso, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for a very insightful and very timely talk, especially in Translation and Studies. Everybody is on edge on what the future holds. Just a couple of thoughts, if I may. Behind all this discussion about technology and growth, I see again us going back to the basics of Marxian thought, if I may, about the alienation of the worker towards his product, the product they create, and the dissatisfaction from the conveyor belt. So we're going back there, and I think that everything has to do with the economic model that is the dominant one worldwide now, which is capitalism. So Sam Altman says there is no wall. The idea is for a constant growth, linear growth, but the planet has shown that there is limits to the possibilities and where we can reach by that. So I was wondering what your opinion is on degrowth and whether your idea on small language models is tied up to that one. Because that, for me, that's the only way to proceed. Unless we scale down, I can't see a way out of this. And if I may add, I'm not technophobic or anything. I mean, I'm definitely not. And I do see the privileges and the goods that come from technology. But like the previous speaker said, or rather unlike what the previous speaker said, I don't think that translation or technology are good or bad. They are instruments. So like Naoki Sakai has proved, translation can be a language for understanding and communication, but it can also be a language of seclusion and separation and building walls. So what I mean is that translation, languages, technologies are all potentially very, very positive for the profit, the well-being of humankind, as you suggested it could be. But the way that the production and society is organized today does not aim for that. So I think that technology is a little ahead of us socially and politically. I mean, we're not mature enough for this kind of technology. It's come too early. So unless we realize that and scale down, which is what I started with, I think that we are already paying the price, actually. And I'm not only talking about translators as a profession, but the whole planet. Sorry for talking too much. Really, thank you for your presentation. It was very, very insightful and stimulating. Thank you.
Thank you. I've tried to limit what I've written about to something that's relevant to translation rather than the sort of global situation, because it's the whole, I've read some Jason Hickel stuff about degrowth, and I agree with it, but there's not much we can sort of do about that. It's a sort of, exactly as you said, it's the sort of the society we're in. So what we can sort of be effective in writing about it is within this translation space. And so for that reason, I've not really ended up going in that direction. The digital Taylorism thing is definitely broader than translation too, and harks back to the work of Braverman in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, talking about, I think it's labor process theory, about the sort of devaluing, and that's a very much sort of a Marxist perspective. So I in short, I'm in agreement, but I'm also aware of the very small sphere of influence we have, and of trying to see what we can achieve within that, I suppose. So maybe a little bit more modest than world changing. Thank you for the point and comment, though. Sorry. Yeah.
On that note, I just wonder, you mentioned the model that 2M, the Transition Agency Australia, that adopts. Yeah, I think that's perhaps related to the sustainability of the profession and also the triple bottom line you introduced as well. So I wondered if you could introduce more of how 2M operates, and how is it an exemplary, perhaps, agency for the profession?
Yeah, I'm sort of wary of, speaking for one individual company or putting one individual company or another. But then on the other hand, I did mention them, so it's my own fault. So I mean, one example is for use of MT in post editing, that for working with their translators, it's done in discussion rather than imposed on them. And then there's the option of payment per word as usual, or per hour, or per edit. So they use the memo queue data for the technical effort, so the number of edits made, and then make payments based on that, which should mean that if the MT is better quality, then the payment is less. But this is only sort of done in discussion with translators. So the reason I mentioned that is because I was in the University of Queensland in 2019 and visited 2M at the time. But funnily enough, Peter Reynolds from MOQ is Irish. He's from Dublin, so I see him when he visits back, and I mentioned that 2M were using their technical effort report, and he said, "Oh, that's not very accurate." So that's one sort of downside. But he said they were going to work on improving that. They didn't think anyone was using it, but I think in principle this idea of working with translators and bringing in technology and discussion, offering different options for payment or discounts, I was in favor of that, and that seemed to be a more sustainable approach than just unilaterally saying, "You will use this. This is the discount. Take it or leave it."
So do they use the same corpora for like they use the same database or the same MT engine, or it's different engines for different jobs? And
that I don't know.
Okay,
and this was this was from 2019, and other than following Tia Dieterich on LinkedIn, I'm not up to date on what they're doing. So but that it's noticeable, and not just her, but lots of other people, in their LinkedIn posts are trying to foreground their efforts in terms of ethics, and that's something in general that I think is a good thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yes. So Chris asks, when translators charge too much, is that unethical, or?
And he reminds of the translation, her previous comment, that translators have agency over their own choices important. Going back to basics, in her opinion, is also going back to producing expert translation, achieving a very high level of specialization in areas where risk and perceived risk are taken as far more important than lowest price at all costs. Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, I don't know that specialists translation jobs are available for everyone, but also not everyone has that level of skill. So perhaps it's not an option over to everyone, but having that level of expertise, achieving high specialization is of course the ideal, and they should get that level of skill. Absolutely. When they charge too much, is that unethical? I suppose it depends on the situation. If how much is too much? I don't know. If someone's taking advantage of someone, then I guess that is unethical.
Yeah, how much is too much? And having lived and worked in Australia, we often talk with students that by the fact that living in Australia, where there is a higher minimum wage, it puts freelance translators over there to disadvantageous position as well, because the living cost. Whereas if you hire somebody who lives in a different country, then driven by the profits, so going back to the P of the profits of the triple bottom line, then the balance is always perhaps the most difficult to achieve. Chris continues that he says, they should get that when the translation discussion space is colonized. But PMT and the low end, or the special translator said their rates too low.
Just I had a point to make a moment ago, and is to do with translators charging too much. Actually, going back to that point, is that ideally, you'd want to have a fair relationship between stakeholders in the production of anything, where if translators are charging too much, then that's not really sustainable either. What seems to work best for all parties is when there's a long-term relationship of trust that's been built up over time, and I would hope that's something that, Chris, you might agree with. And Chris, you want to talk a little bit about the specialized translators setting their rates too low? I agree that's colonized by talk of PEMT, and maybe that's been the case for quite some time. And it's noticeable that in the most recent European Language Industry Survey report that that PEMT now seems to have gone to over 50% of reported production. Do you want to unmute, Chris, and speak about this a bit?
Hey.
Yeah. Hi, Chris.
Hi, I'm not sure I'm on the right camera here, but thank you. I missed the first part of your talk. I'm so sorry about that. One of my points is that translators bid too low if they're not specialized. And if all the talk, if the space of discussing translation is garment rending and, we should be paid more and it's not fair, you're missing the whole part of the market which is paying properly, right? And translators are coming into, I'm a professional translator, not an academic, but translators are coming into certain job types, quoting so low that there is no way on earth they can do the research to get to the level of expertise they would need to be to charge well. The specific example, which I gave at one of the financial translators workshops, was a day rate for a financial translator in my country would be maybe 1,200 euros. And I was asked by a client to find translators in Arabic, Japanese, Italian, Spanish, which I don't do, of course, to do this quite technical text, right? They quoted to me about 250, 240 euros hesitantly, right? I was supposedly coordinating this for the client. That these translators didn't know where the market was astonishing to me. And I can only assume it's because they've been working through the type of, agencies putting pressure on them to lower their rates. If that information is not known and shared, where are we going here? And when I related that example, an agency owner told me he thought I was being unethical in quoting a price like that, my price per day for these other guys. I was taken aback, actually. It's not unethical. Are you kidding me? My job to be able to produce the technical translations I do is to spend vast amounts of time reading things and talking to clients and being out there in their space, right? And that time is not free. That's time I've invested in me. And so when I go into a negotiation talking about fair pricing, no, no. I mean, you don't throw that in their face, but you create trust through your specialization. And the fairness talk, I mean, that goes someplace else. That's another discussion. Sorry, but great talk. And I'm going to go back and listen to the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Good to see you. Yeah, I mean, my only comment there would be that yeah, I don't suggest that translation should be a charity case at all. But and it's if we look at the Hertzberg motivation theory, it's important that people are paid enough that they can live comfortably, and but it's also important to have the sort of work, to expect people to have the sort of interaction with technology that they can be motivated by and find satisfying. There's no way that you would take on work that involves working with decomposed sections of text where you don't really know the context, and nor should you. So it's important to be aware of what motivates people and not expect people to do something that will be completely thankless.
Thanks, Joss, and also thanks, Chris, for sharing your experiences with us. That's absolutely an appalling experience, but we do see those competitions and and those inquiries and negotiations in the market, unfortunately. So do we have more questions from audience? Well, maybe while we wait, maybe we'll just go on for another 5 or 10 minutes in case audience have more questions. But while we wait, Jules, I've been because I know you wrote that article with on the decent work perspective on translators. I think it was published in Perspectives about translators in the platform economy, which is also related to what you talk about today. But then against this background of these algorithmic norms, do you have any speculations or predictions as to the work a decent what kind of impacts the algorithmic norms are going to have on the working conditions of translators? Is there any update on the research?
No, my suggestion wasn't so much that, that wasn't so much on the effects of the livelihoods or the conditions of translators, because that's already happening. And that is, that's been documented in things like Gökhan Firat's work. So Gökhan Firat is a Turkish researcher who did a PhD in Surrey that I was an external co-supervisor for. And his PhD is freely available. But my suggestion is that these conditions essentially is following the sort of Christina Abdallah angle. This is going to materially affect the translated output if people are working under these sort of conditions. If their main focus when working within a digital platform is to satisfy algorithmic management, then that becomes more important than producing a translation that fulfills our needs and expectations. All of a sudden, here's the importance of the translation, but here's the importance of the algorithmic management. Satisfying that becomes more important, because otherwise they don't get other jobs. Within the EU, the AI Act has made it illegal to have fully automated job allocation, I understand, but even if it's semi-automated, the suggestion from the Lights Out project management system to employ one translator over another, I think is liable to be accepted by a human project manager, because if they disagree with the machine recommendation, then they're taking responsibility on themselves for making this different decision And if there's a problem with the translation, the responsibility falls on the project manager. If they follow the recommendation of the AI tool, well, then they can always say, well, this is the one that was recommended to me. Who was I to know that this translator wasn't very reliable, for example?
Oh, I see. Yeah, thanks for more background to that piece of work. Yeah. Well, then, yeah, that's also an ethical choice, right? If you are taking on board the translators playing the agent, exerting the agency in making the choices, whether they're going to go with the AI translation outputs or their own post-edited or fresh translation. Oh, so Gita has a question on the NeuroMT and wiki. So AI is made by human, and it certainly has limitations in providing information. So in translation, how can we overcome the limitations of neural machine translation system that can affect translation accuracy, especially in document or literary writing?
Overcome the limitations. Thanks for the question, Geeta. In terms of trying to make the output better, excuse me, there are possibilities for fine-tuning. There are a number of options for fine-tuning large language models or making custom MT systems for specific domains. A number of people I've worked with, people like Antonio Torral, who's now based in Alicante, and Anna Gerberoff works a lot on creativity and MT in her work in Groningen. So it's possible to, custom build systems that will produce better output for your specific domain or your specific requirements. You mentioned the literary domain, and to a point, it seems like it's possible to produce reasonable quality, but the results of reception studies have not been entirely positive, especially for literary texts. So, I mean, there's there seems to be a bit of snobbiness amongst some of the people involved with reception studies, where they're saying, well, maybe for a Dan Brown novel, this might be fine, but for the sort of material I like to read, it's not really good enough. And there are problems with narrative engagement and enjoyment, and of voice, so the voice of the individual characters, if there's a lot of dialogue. So there are ways to try and lift the quality, but for most language pairs and circumstances, it's not really sufficient. I don't know if that answers your question. But again, I guess it depends on the domain and the sort of documentation or the sort of document you're talking about translating.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Gita, and Joss for your responses. I guess that concludes the talk and the discussions. Thank you very much, Joss, for a very interesting and inspiring talk. I'm sure this discussions on the sustainability and the translation will continue, for example, especially at the IELTS conference in December. Some colleagues are attending as well. Then again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you very much, Joss, again. We will upload the recording of the seminar onto the center's YouTube channel if you would like to review it. Otherwise, have a nice day, evening, morning, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Clara. Thanks, Esther. Good to see you all. Thanks for sticking with it. Bye-bye.